Can we reimagine the systems we live in? How can economics reflect our common humanity? And can we change it in time?
Welcome back to Real Time with Steve and friends. We've got George Selgin on the show today. We're going to be talking about loanable funds and endogenous money theory. Hopefully Steve and George can get along by the end of the show and we're all friends, but who knows? Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
There you are. Here I am. We're live and about to have some more real time with Steve Keen and friends. I'm Dave Folks, your host. Our friend this week, or should I say frenemy, is George Selgin, a senior fellow and director emeritus at the Centre for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at the Cato Institute and a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Georgia. He's known for his extensive work on free banking and monetary policy and has authored several influential books, including The Theory of Free Banking and Good Money. The big question for today is, do banks create money out of thin air? Poof. Or do they act as intermediaries of the finite loanable funds of depositors? In a practical sense, from day to day, you and I couldn't possibly tell from our various interactions with banks which of these theories is true. So does it matter? Yes. If so, what are the implications of each approach? This is what we aim to dig into today, and I should warn you, this is unlikely to be a meeting of minds. If you've been following Steve and this live stream for any amount of time, you'll know that Steve has gone into detail many times about the dynamics of debt creation and its impact on economic cycles, arguing that the ability of banks to create money can lead to credit bubbles and financial instability if not properly regulated. Maybe even if it is regulated but not enforced properly. George has challenged this thin air theory, as he calls it, and has a focus on how savings lead to investments and the role of interest rates in this process, which is then used to adjust the supply of loanable funds with demand. Competitive banks is a loaded form, by the way, a loaded term, so it means different things to different people. But in a free market, they can manage money in an economy without interference from government, or more specifically, a central bank. They could even have their own currencies. But I'm sure that will trigger lots of questions in your minds already, and I can almost hear the clickety-clack of questions and comments from our chatters. So start your engines. So yes, I'm very much in a title fight today. We are live on Twitter, at Prof. Steve Keen, LinkedIn, Dr. Steve Keen, and YouTube, Prof. Steve Keen. Make sure you subscribe, follow, like, and hit the notification bell. Think someone might be interested in this topic? Go ahead and retweet this live now, because the more of you there are here with us now in real time, the better the atmosphere. And if you're watching later on, why not join us live next time and join in the chat? Now, we'll be looking out for your questions and trying to put them to Steve or George. But as you know, I want you to know that the broad aim is to have 3 rounds to cover. And therefore, what I want to look at is round 1 to get terms of reference from George and Steve so that we can understand their positions clearly. Round 2, assuming one of these approaches is what drives decision-making in the banking sector and presumably central banks, what are the implications of each one economically, and which one, or perhaps another theory, is currently in the driving seat of decision-making? Who and what actually runs the world of credit at the moment? And then round 3, what would an ideal system of banking and loaning look like, presuming we don't have one currently? How could it respond better than the current system in a crisis? I'm hoping there might be a link for George there too, from loanable funds to the productive norm and what he calls good deflation versus bad deflation. So I think it's going to be a really interesting talk. See if you can get your questions answered in those sections, because, hold your fire basically and see if the answer is there for you already, because I don't really want to interrupt George or Steve with too many questions as it pulls them out of their train of thought. But of course, we'll be looking out for your questions and putting them to our guests as much as we can. So without further ado, let's welcome the star of the show, Steve Keen. Oh, we've got George. No, but George has gone away and Steve's in.
I was thinking you should let the guests go first.
No, I was thinking you'd changed quite a bit. So you're back in Amsterdam now for a bit?
Yeah. I've got a couple of weeks here. I'm traveling around, the usual sort of story, too much travel here. And I think I'll be finally arranging a visiting scholars visa here, so I don't have to worry about the Selgin visa exclusion anymore, which would be a nice change.
Why is that? I don't understand.
Well, I've been as an Aussie, I've been getting away with living, like having a house in the Netherlands and spending about half my time here and half my time somewhere else because I have to. Because with the visa waiver you and I get as Antipodeans when we travel to Europe, we can spend no more than 90 days out of 180 in the Shenzhen region. So I've been juggling that for about 5 years. It's about time I did.
Brits now. I've got both.
That's right. Yeah, I know. The Brit used to give me that same freedom before the unfortunate referendum result. So yeah.
Don't mention the B word.
True.
It's still funny how people just avoid it even now. It's like it was subject. I think
it was such a stuff up. I mean, I voted for it because I saw it as a protest vote against the European Union, trusting the polls that it was going to lose, which is the same thing David Cameron did before he lost his job the day.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I just thought a protest vote. You know the Australian situation. You can vote. You can do a protest vote in Australia by voting in optional preferential voting. So you whack you don't like the Liberal or the Labor, so you whack the first one Greens, the second one's Communist, the third Fred Nile, if you want to really be totally perverse, and the fourth vote goes to Labor. And you basically, the scrutiny is no, you don't like them, but you're still forced to vote for them. I did the same thing. Holy shit, when I woke up the next morning, really the damn thing had won. Anyway,
in Australia still. Yeah, no, I had a good mate of mine tell me the same thing, and I was like, "Oh, great." I didn't think it was a place for tactical voting.
And even referenda in Australia. I mean, I dislike it in some ways, but the Australian system for a referendum vote, it must be a majority of electors in a majority of states, and we're rather than first past the post. Of course, the Brits go first past the post, so a 50.1% vote wins against the 49.9% Remain, who wanted to remain quite literally. And if they'd actually said by a majority of electors in a majority of electorates, it wouldn't have passed. And that's a fairer representation of the overall. So I think, again, as usual, the Brits did it badly.
Yeah, basically. It was set up badly. And I wasn't thinking that we'd probably be talking the politics of Brexit on this particular.
Not what I expected. Let's get onto the topic.
Let's get on to the topic. I think what we might do is bring. I'm guessing I haven't seen Mike. I'm guessing Mike's not with us today. But
you actually made a couple of comments. He's made comments in the comment stream, so maybe he's somewhere about.
Excellent. Oh, Mike is here in more than just spirit.
Bring him in. Bring him in. Yeah. Okay.
Come on, where's Mike? Oh, there he is.
Here.
Thank goodness.
Hey,
we didn't see you in the pre-chat, mate. So I wasn't sure if you're here. Good to see you.
No, I was there, but I was just kept in the background, so I was just listening to you guys chit chat. So
Very good. All right. What have you been up to this week?
Well, I passed my last ham radio exam, federal exam yesterday, so I have full privileges on all the ham airwaves. So that was a bit of a milestone for me personally. And I'm still working on rehabbing a trailer for a nonprofit organization. So as soon as I'm finished here, I'm going to go back to my shop and continue wrestling with plywood. The stupid trailer nothing is square. Everything's curvy and out of whack. So it's tricky business, but keeps me out of trouble.
So tell me about because my father, my stepfather-in-law was actually into ham radio as well. He got into it, like we're talking 50s and 60s from memory when he told me about it. But there was this whole community back then, and it's still vibrant. So there's tons of people still using ham radio that you would tap into, and that's what you're doing with it. Tell me a bit about it, because I didn't even know it was still around as a big thing.
Well, ham radio is technically the amateur radio service, emphasis on the word service. So in the United States, the FCC grants the hams privileges on certain chunks of the radio frequency spectrum. But in return for that, we're expected to do service. So in an emergency, a hurricane or something, an ice storm, a lost child, or for things like parades and marathons and what have you, the hams provide communications. And we're often motivated by various contests and things to practice doing that. So, for example, at the end of this month, there's something that's called Field Day. It's a big deal. And all the hams are supposed to take their stuff and go into the field and operate, pretending and practicing as though there's an emergency. So using solar panels and batteries and what have you. So it's lots of fun. Also, it's a gateway to STEM, because to be a ham, you have to be knowledgeable about things like physics and electrical engineering and atmospheric science, space science, and on it goes. And so it's for young kids, it's really a nice way to introduce them to the STEM areas. And hopefully they find out that they're might be a little hard, but it's kind of fun and you can do it if you try. So the organization I work with is for K through 12 kids. And we use ham radio to get them interested in STEM areas.
Wow.
So the back in the day when it was first out, it was like, this is the way it seemed to be to my stepfather-in-law. It was like it was the first internet, because globally people could connect with each other, right? Is that what it felt? But that is the history of it, right? That's kind of the thing it was, the first global decentralized communications network, which is really kind of mind-blowing when you think about it like that, because this was just after World War II. Is that how the history of it seems to you, or is that stretching it?
No, that's absolutely true. And of course, hams were responsible for many advances in radios over the years, experimenting. In fact, they're encouraged to experiment. And you can even get extra special privileges if you can tell the FCC that you're working on something interesting and new. Today, obviously we have cell phones. So to tell somebody, hey, you can talk to somebody on the other side of the world with this thing called ham radio, they're like, well, I can do that with a cell phone. But we can do things today like bouncing signals off satellites and meteors and the moon, talking to the astronauts on the International Space Station, so on and so forth, controlling the kids in our club put up high altitude balloons. And as long as the Air Force doesn't shoot them down, they're running all sorts of experiments.
Have you tested that theory?
So, the last one we launched landed right next to a runway at Hanscom Air Force Base out here in Massachusetts. And the chasers of the balloon were detained at the beginning because Hanscom did not have the balloon on their radar. And so what has just landed on our property? And luckily we had the right FAA, Federal Aeronautics Administration paperwork. And so they let everybody go.
All right,
loving the conversation, but let's get George in here.
Let's get the top 10
audience
done.
are getting.
Yeah, fair enough. George, welcome to Real Time with Steve Keen and Friends. How are you? How's Grenada?
Thank you, Dave. I'm fine, and Grenada is just great. I appreciate being on the show.
Very good. Well, good to have you. And did I do your intro justice? Are those all the things that you would like to be known for? Or is there maybe just, if you could, just give us a bit of a roundup for somebody who's unfamiliar with your background? It's just how you got into the world that you're in, and perhaps what's led you to working at the Cato Institute.
Well, the early background I'll cover very quickly, just because it's a little too involved to go into in
Of course
detail.
it is, yeah.
I started out interested in marine biology, and a number of things got me interested in economics, starting with my father encouraging me to study it. He was a socialist. He hoped that if I majored in econ, I would get out there and show all these idiotic free market economists what's what. He was deeply disappointed with the consequences, to put it mildly. But I ended up going into monetary economics, as is obvious. And I did start out, Dave, as you suggested, with this research program looking into less regulated banking systems and how they worked, and asking how in general free market banking system with no central bank or deposit insurance and all that, how such a system would function. I've since branched out and do a bunch of different things, but mostly in monetary. And I was an academic until about 10 years ago, a little bit less, when I was offered the opportunity to create a center for research at the Cato Institute. And by then I was quite tired of the academy. So I really found it hard to refuse, particularly since they'd already raised a lot of money for the place when they offered me the opportunity to run it. So that was about, as I said, about 10 years ago. And, recently I stepped down from that directorship in order to have a little more freedom, including the freedom to come here to Grenada. And now I still work for Cato, but in a different capacity, mostly writing books. And I'll just add that my current big project is a book on the New Deal and recovery from the Great Depression, and what the New Deal's contribution to that recovery was.
Well, maybe we'll get to talking about that towards the end there, especially around, it doesn't seem like economists have ever agreed generally on what caused or what happened after the Great Depression. So I think there's room for discussion there, I think, Steve and Mike.
Definitely.
So,
yeah.
But should we get this rumble on the road? Because George, you and Steve don't necessarily see eye to eye. So I was going to set this up as
maybe not completely.
Not completely, no. But let's set this up then. It's as the prize fight that it is. And let me do a proper introduction for both of you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Clash of the Loanable Stash. In the red corner, hailing from Australia, weighing in with a PhD in economics from the University of New South Wales, known for taking the piss out of mainstream economists and for predicting the 2008 financial crisis, please give a warm welcome to the radical economist, author of Debunking Economics and the New Economics, the champion of the Minskian School of Thought, Steve Keen. And in the blue corner, from the United States, a heavyweight in monetary economics, holder of a PhD in economics from New York University, the director of the Cato Institute Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives, author of Money, Free and Unfree, George Selgin. Okay, good. Some of you are still here. All right, gentlemen, listen.
Okay, that's nailed, definitely.
Listen up. We're here for a clean intellectual brawl, no low blows, stick to the facts and solid arguments. I'm sure you will. Look, what I want to do in round one is, George and Steve, could our audience get a clear understanding of references from you both in turn so that we understand your positions clearly and what is meant by loanable funds versus endogenous money? So George, as our guest, could I get you to go first? But I'm going to get you to describe Steve's view on how banks create money, and I'll get Steve for you to concur and correct, if you don't mind. And that way we'll know you're both on the same page. So go ahead, George.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Well, another way to put the question that this debate is are banks intermediaries or not? And an intermediary is an institution, in this case, a financial institution that borrows money from one set of people and lends to another set. Or putting it a little bit differently, it issues IOUs from one set of persons and acquires IOUs from another. There are some financial institutions that everybody agrees do this. An example would be a bond mutual fund, or what you in the UK call a bond unit trust. Nobody thinks that these institutions could invest in bonds unless they acquired savings from others for the purpose of doing so. So that's the sense in which they qualify as intermediaries. The big question, our question, is whether banks fit that description. And the argument that they don't qualify, that they don't deal in loanable funds in the sense of acquiring savings from, say, one group and lending to another, has to do with their money creating abilities. An ordinary, or let's say an indisputable intermediary, in order to buy IOUs, has got to get money, because money is the medium of exchange. And so it has to acquire money, which it can't recreate itself, in order to acquire the IOUs that it's in the business of buying. Banks are different. Banks own IOUs serve as money. They can be used to buy all kinds of stuff. Most of the things we buy with bank-created IOUs, deposits mainly. And so the argument that I'm criticizing is that banks, unlike real intermediaries, can do all the investing they want to, acquire all the assets that they like, without having to borrow from anyone else. And they can do that simply by writing up deposits for borrowers, or using deposits they create, essentially costlessly, to buy other kinds of assets. They could acquire bonds, etc. And again, this is just a matter of a few keystrokes on a computer. There are no costs involved to a bank, no real cost, no resource cost to creating deposits for the purpose of allowing people to borrow, or for the purpose of acquiring assets. And that's why I call this, and I'm not the first one, the thin air theory of banking, that they can create deposits and create credit out of thin air. They don't have to go around hat in hand borrowing from other people to get resources with which to acquire their assets. I hope that I'm doing justice to the theory. And I should say, I'm only trying to summarize a kind of generic version of the theory. I'm not doing certainly justice to Steve's any particular insights on this, which he has his own special contributions, of course. But that's the general view that I think that I'm trying to address, the kind of a generic version.
Steve and Mike, is that how you see it? Was that clear? Was that needed?
It's the only qualification I make. We're not saying it's without costs. There's obviously costs involved, and you've got to have physical branches. You have to have loans, offices, etc., etc. Definitely costs in originating money. But what they're fundamentally saying is there is no pot out of which banks transfer to create loans, whereas the loanable funds fundamentally says there's some sort of pot. Now, what I like about what you did in your paper, George, and this is one reason I was annoyed with you on Twitter, is that you went through a range of simplifying assumptions that I 100% agreed with, and then you criticised me for one of my agreements with you, which I think is silly. I want to get that off my chest initially. So you said, like, a lot of loanable funds people will say effectively ignore the fact that bank deposits are demand deposits. No, you don't ignore that. You actually say that you're leaving the banks have demand deposits and they do not lend from the demand deposits. And that was perfectly sensible. You also said, I'm going to ignore cash. And I thought that's great, because that actually rules out the money multiplier model, which is one of the many ways in they're not many. There are basically two ways that neoclassical textbooks teach that banks can create money. One is, well, not create money. Well, actually, there's only one, and that is the money multiplier. Because if you look at the Mankiw text or any other standard economic textbook, they'll say that banks take in cash and then they hang on to 10% of it, lend out 90, and then on you go and you get a an iterative process that creates money. And of course, both elements of that are controlled by the government. You have the government has to create the cash in the first instance, because outside of one of your specialties, which I'm happy to have a conversation about later, the free banking period, where banks actually did create their own notes. They're very much something that happened in the 19th century America, Australia, and New Zealand too, actually, quite interestingly. So you've ruled that out, and that means we can't use the money multiplier model to explain how money is created. And I appreciate that, removing that particular confusion from the discussion group. So you then, in your paper, end up saying that the form of lending you're looking at, the borrowing that banks actually have to do, is the interbank market. So because we have multiple banks in a private banking, whether it's private or it's a system with the government central bank, we have the numerous banks, and I might bank with Lloyd's, and you might bank with Bank of America, and then if I want to buy something off you, as well as if I borrow money from Lloyd's and then use that to buy something off you, and your example was the Air Bank, I think it was, in your example. So was it Julie? I forgot. Was your female? On that?
I always forget her name as well, Steve. Just use any old name you want.
Okay, I'll use Julia. Just for the sake of argument, I'll use Julia. And then Julia borrows money and then buys from Larry, I think you had. So you had Julia banking with one bank and Larry with another. And then in that particular case, the bank Julia's with Air Bank doesn't have sufficient reserves, whatever the loan is. So you had Julia borrowing $5,000 and spending that on Larry's secondhand cars. Then in that particular case, if the Air Bank has less than $5,000 in reserves, they can make the transfer only if the other bank is willing to lend them back the reserves that they're now deficient in, which is the interbank market. So you basically said interbank market lending is completely ignored by the thin air banking analysts, and when you include interbank lending, then you have a form of loanable funds, and if that didn't exist, then the banks could not create money in the first instance.
Steve, I'm just going to step in for a sec. Could I get you to do the reverse, just to explain George's theory, so that we're on common terms? And
that's what I was trying to do. That's what I was trying to do. So
okay,
George agrees, and this is something which, whether we agree or not in this conversation, George, and they're likely that we're not going to agree, but whether we agree or not, I do appreciate that you, in setting up your paper, you ruled out a number of explanations for money creation, which just confused the issue. So one of the is that the banks take in cash and lend out cash. That's money multiplier. You've ruled that out, and that's one thing clarifying. The other is that banks have term deposits, and if it's term deposit, if you lend a term deposit, you can't have access to it. So if you go and check your term deposit, it's going to rise. The amount of money effectively is going to rise or fall depending whether it's been lent out by the bank or not, and you've got no control over that. You've got to accept it. But demand deposits are what banks actually offer. So if I went to go to the local auto bank here to get some cash out to buy something I can't buy with credit or a bank transfer in Amsterdam, of course, I shouldn't use Amsterdam, because in Amsterdam you can buy whatever you like with the transfer. When I go to my local coffee shop, I swipe my card. Okay, if I wanted to go a non-coffee shop country, I'd need cash. Okay, so you've ruled that out. That's great. So what you're saying is banks can create money by recording a sum of money in somebody's deposit account and recording the same sum of money as additional debt that person owes to them. And that's exactly the approach to money creation that my side of the debate says is why banks can create money. So you've clarified it. We are talking about exactly the same thing, but you say that because the banks, because there's a multi-bank system, and banks have to transfer money between each other to enable the buying and selling we do in a market economy to occur, that lending therefore constrains what they can do in terms of money creation.
Yeah, if I might elaborate, thank you, Steve. I appreciate that summary. I do think we need to get away from talking about cash and talking about time deposits is a lot of things we should abstract from. And I also quickly want to add, we can talk about this more later. My view isn't that banks are perfect intermediaries by any means. I think, though, that perspective is actually, on the whole, more helpful than assuming that they can extend credit without any resource constraints. And by the way, I should have not misrepresented you as saying that they don't need any resources. That was an oversimplification. I meant they don't need to borrow. They don't need to borrow funds. They don't face a funding cost as such.
Yeah.
I do want to push back a little bit on part of your description of my view. My view is that banks do have to borrow. They sometimes borrow in the interbank market. They also sometimes borrow directly from central banks, but they do borrow from depositors. And what the way I want to put this, though, in order to avoid this sounding more like a naive money multiplier story than it is that basically what I'm arguing is that banks are constrained in the amount they can lend by the real willingness of people to hold on to their IOUs. Doesn't matter who. And when I say the real willingness, I mean people's willingness to have a certain amount of real purchasing power in these IOUs, so we don't have an inflationary, indeterminacy. And so depositors count here. If a bank is lucky enough to have people, even a borrower, let's take a case of a bank borrower. I make a loan, I'm a bank, I make $1,000 loan to Julia. And Julia sits on that deposit. She doesn't spend it. In that artificial case, she's a depositor at my bank now, to that extent, at least. She's also lending to me. She's a lender and a borrower, which is not what people usually do when they borrow from the bank. But she is making it easier for me to make that loan to her and get away with it. In fact, I can get away with it forever with no other resources as long as she sits on the money. Now, when she spends the money to go buy the used car, she's still a borrower, but she's no longer lending to me. She's not holding on to my IOUs. She's not funding her own loan at that point. And my argument, not to go into it anymore, is at that point, the bank had better have someone else hold on to that IOU somewhere. But if they don't, if they send it back to the clearing system at the margin, the bank's going to have to come up with resources to cover the settlement. That's so.
Yeah. See, intrigued. We actually had a good chat about your father's history, and actually, I'd be intrigued to get further into that. Would you be willing to discuss it? I know family things can be a bit painful, but that'd be intriguing to hear.
No, it's all right. Yeah,
good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my father.
He was a good guy. I love my father,
good.
even though he was a socialist. Although he read the East German version of Soviet life one night, I said to him, "Papa, how can you read that stuff? It's all propaganda." He says, "Well, so's all our magazines here in the United States." And I said, "So's our magazine." I said, "Which one?" Anyway, actually, we argued about everything.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. Okay. Well, my father was actually very untalkative. Getting a word out of my father was a bit like finding, finding. I hadn't a decent analogy, but digging for gold was easier than getting a word out of my father. But at the same time, he was the settlements officer for the Commonwealth Bank. So I know settlements. I did them when I was 7 years old. Okay, so and the story about what settlements and happens at settlements and so on, I got that well and truly explained to me by my father. So I know them pretty much inside out. And Dad's every 4 o'clock every day going off to the Reserve Bank when it was still actually the Commonwealth Bank, and then being involved in the net settlements that were involved in that whole process. And I have to say, there's only one time that I heard about that leading to a catastrophe, which is actually a company called Cambridge Credit back in 1963, I think, in Australia. So the event you're talking about, which you say constrains the capacity of banks to create money, is a marginal thing, which does matter when there's extreme booms going on. It does happen. And in fact, the global experts on talking about that are they're not Austrian economists, they're not neoclassical, they tend to be post-Keynesian and evolutionary, like Hyman Minsky talking about the collapse of Penn State in, I think, 1966. I'm mentioning Cambridge Credit in 1963. So it does happen. Okay, there are points in time where banks are regarded as dodgy by their fellows. The most recent one, of course, being Northern Rock in the UK, and then also Silicon Valley Bank, and just in last year. So it does happen. It is important, but it's relatively trivial. Okay, the period that will happen normally when there's too much private debt around, not when there's it's a debt bubble breaking that tends to lead to those catastrophes. And you will always have rogue banks that go crazy and lending too much, like your example of the AYR Air Bank back in the 1600s. Okay? But fundamentally, the point that when am I going to round two here without actually the referee declaring we've moved across to round two?
Not quite. We're nearly there. Well, actually,
okay.
Steve, I do want
to hear the bell.
Let's the referee referee needs to ring a bell. Let's ring a bell here.
We're not quite there, but because I wanted Mike, if I could just as not quite an outsider, if you see what I mean, but looking in, I wanted an overview, Mike, and I wondered if you can help. But tell me if you can, or uncertain, however you like. For our audience, why is this seeming abstraction so important? And following up a little bit on what Steve was starting to hint at there, what are the implications in the real world for it definitely being one or the other? Would it matter? I mean, how would we see it play out if we were definitely playing by one set of rules and not another? Is that something you can answer?
Well, I don't think that Steve and George are all that far apart on what they're describing. Does it matter? Well, now we have to start getting into policies, and as they work their way through the system, what happens. Of course, I'm biased, but that cries out for dynamic modeling. Some of the sort of mental models that the public has about, well, all economic things, but let's take banking, comes from very simplistic ideas. I was always told as an undergraduate economics major that banking was a 3-6-3 business, that banks borrowed at 3%, lent out at 6%, and the bankers were on the golf course at 3 p.m. It was a very simple business. Obviously, it's more complicated, and when you start keeping track of debits and credits, double entry accounting, assets and liabilities, and so forth, you start to see that it's way more complicated than that. The settlement stuff, the behind the scenes stuff, the public doesn't see, obviously, so that contributes to the confusion. What I'd like to see is, in cases like this, let's have a model, and let's have Steve and George agree or disagree on every equation, every aspect of the model, every causal relationship. I'm going to guess they're going to agree on 95% of what happens, or what, the structure of the system. And then let's run the model one way and the other way, and let's see what happens. Oftentimes it doesn't matter for the big picture where people are bickering. But that, how do you disentangle these issues? Even among professional economists, let alone the general public, you've got to have tools. People don't follow T accounts. If you start doing the traditional money, credit, and banking T account textbook stuff, people float to the ceiling. Their eyes gloss over. So, we need better tools to lay this stuff out and experiment. Finally, I'll say what economists are not trained to do typically is get out from behind their desks and go find out how the real world works. They have theory, which is you get out a pencil and paper and build some mathematical contraption. And then the real world is now you go to a Federal Reserve Bank data website and download a spreadsheet and torture it with econometrics. Nobody ever goes to a bank and says, I'm studying the banking system. Can you please tell me what you do all day? And then write your equations.
But for what it's worth, my boss for a while at Cato, not for very long, was a banker, John Allison, pretty good banker, actually, to judge by the success of his bank. And we had lots of long conversations about stuff. I won't say he always agreed with me, but I did hear his point of view about things, which I assume qualifies as that of somebody who knew something about how banks work. So I wasn't always behind my desk, and no one has ever accused me of torturing anyone with econometrics.
That's true. You actually look on that front. You don't like I'm sort of I'm a dynamic modeler, so I'm in the same camp as Mike. I don't do equilibrium thinking at all, but I'm into dynamic modeling. But you're not a user of mathematical models?
No, but I will say, Steve, it's just it is entirely a matter of my aptitudes. It's a personal preference. I don't mind. I think that some people do better using those things. It's just not my thing, and I have to do what I'm good at. And that's
Fair
all.
enough.
That's my only excuse for what I do and what I don't do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so have you heard of my software Minsky?
I have. I've seen
Have you
it on your
downloaded a
website.
copy yet?
I haven't. I'm sorry.
You should, because it's the double entry bookkeeping of what we need to talk about, and that's where my perspective has come from. And when you look at double entry bookkeeping, and that's what I did in my reply to you, and using Minsky software to do it. I didn't write any of those equations. The Minsky generates them when you put the double entry bookkeeping together. And what you get out of it is that you cannot get reserves into the aggregate equation for the impact of lending by banking sectors. So if you say let's have more than one bank, like let's say 73 banks, would that do you rather than two? Pardon
Sounds
me.
like a good number, yeah.
73 banks. I put 73 banks together, and then I had banks creating money, as we both agree they do, by marking up deposits and marking up loans at the same time, and then have them doing interbank transfers and so on. And I might have 4 or 5 of them, or maybe 2, more realistic. Out of 73, and maybe 2 will have their refusals. I'd get a tiny impact of that on the aggregate creation of money by the banking sector, but only a tiny. So if you look at the double entry bookkeeping, what you put forward is the way in which banks create money. At the aggregate level, reserves play virtually no role. They don't constrain. And that's where we differ. That you think that even though you acknowledge what anybody I know in the post-Keynesian world would accept as a definition of bank lending, which is endogenous money. So that's why whether we agree or not, I appreciate you doing that. And I said that on Twitter before I read my reply to you. The way you've defined bank money creation is exactly the same way that the post-Keynesian community defines it. So you're virtually the first economist to do that. First
George, can I
neo-classical.
get you to just reply that quickly, and then we're going to do the chatters list. We're going to get Mike this week. I'm going to get you to do that in a moment. But George, go ahead and reply to that. If you like.
Yeah, very quickly. So there are 2 kinds of arguments that I have to make in defense of my loanable funds or banks or intermediaries views. The easy one is the one where you have one bank creating deposits, which nobody should dispute banks being able to do that. And the easy argument is showing how this bank acting in isolation from the others incurs a net settlement dues that cause it to have to transfer central bank money, which banks don't create. And if it has limited amounts or starts out with none at all, this is going to be a problem. Of course, in practice, it'll make a last minute request for funds from another bank or from the central bank. But there is a constraint here because those can be costly requests. The hard case, which I think you've alluded to, Steve, is where you have a bunch of banks all lending together in unison. And it's a long-standing argument that in that case, Keynes made this, Schumpeter made it, so you know this. In that case, the argument goes, since they're all going to be expanding together, you have just as many debits as credits growing together at the clearinghouse. They all cancel out. So the banks end up being able to expand willy-nilly because nobody's a net loser in that case. I have an article just about that in the JMCB from way back when, and talking about why, in fact, even in that case, there's a limit. And the limit has to do with the essentially unavoidable randomness of the net clearings. Yeah. And that means that banks have to hold precautionary reserves. So you get some kind of an equilibrium based on the randomness. where reserve supply and reserve demand match. And at that point, the banks can't expand anymore without some of them finding themselves having to retreat. And when that happens, it's like a chain gang. All the prisoners are chained together. If one trips, they all end up stumbling. So anyway, that's a whole separate and much harder to make argument. I do make it for what it's worth about how the system as a whole is constrained by savings. And one last point. If everybody is willing to hold on to more of these bank IOUs so that they don't get into the clearing system, they don't get sent back at all, then the banks can expand in unison or separately for that matter, to the extent that there's that extra demand out there. So everything depends on whether more items are presented for collection through the clearing system or not.
Very good. Keep those thoughts, Steve and Mike, because we'll come back to you in a moment on that. Well, let's have a look at the chatters list for today. Mike, I'm going to get you to tackle this. George, have a listen in because you're going to help us do this again at the end of the show, just as we celebrate our top chatters that are involved. If we can bring up the chatters list. Go for it, Mike.
Okay, well, the list seems to grow every week. I guess that's a good thing. So let's have a crack at this. A. Ben, Dre Guy, Tony Wilson, Econ in One Lesson, Interactive Research, Tomas Sergey, Michael D'Souza Cruz, John Watson, Shumsking, TR, Blue Bay, D. Bruce, Danny Squared, Joe Polito, Owen Wall, Nadia Yvette, Tenny Bruschke, Frankly, Bob Liori, Adrian Terry, Tomas Starlington, Jay Gordy, Michael Newman, J85 Grimm, Dinner with Franklin, Web Freaks, Happy Dude Irwar. Screwed that one up. David Collins, Caruso Roby, Rob, Botched Mandela, East London Crocodile, Scout Johnson, Tom Kopp, Michael D. Smith, Cosmic Blaze, Paul Ranjit Kumar, Alex Marshall, Samuel Orge, Dan, Thomas Equivalent, Rob Pierce, Daniel Lydell, and Chris Hammond. Yeah.
Limbs everywhere. Thank you very much,
You just gotta go.
Mike.
Don't think on it. Just go.
Don't think. Yeah, there's some top advice for the end of the show, George. All right, we are going to move on to round two. Now, just to set the scene on this one, I wanted you both to have a think about, and Mike, as you have a think about which theory is currently driving decision making, because I wanted to bring it to the real world and talk about it less in the abstract, and as in, what does the banking sector think and how do they act day to day with regard to loanable funds versus endogenous money? So to set this up, I have to thank a regular chatter on the show for help here. They pointed me to at least three different central banks, the Bundesbank, the Swedish Riksbank, and even the BOE, that have published advice to say money is effectively created out of thin air. Of course, that doesn't make it the truth, but what here I'm asking is what assumptions are currently being used to make decisions. And so to give you a taste of the sentiments, and I have the links if anyone wants them, but the Bundesbank quote is a good sample. It's pretty clear. That means that banks can create book money just by making an accounting entry, according to the Bundesbank economists. This refutes a popular misconception that banks act simply as intermediaries at the time of lending. So again, this isn't meant to be an attempt to slam dunk. My understanding is that the US banking system, George, operates under an assumption of fractional reserve system, but correct me if I'm wrong, but generally. But what I'm getting at is that endogenous money creation is not like the outlier, it's the norm, at least in Europe. So does that make you an underdog in the fight for truth, justice, and the American way, or is it just a case of, well, they're central banks, so they're the problem?
Well,
and
yeah.
Sorry, Steve, in advance, I've made you look like you're mainstream here, not something you used to.
Oh my. Well, first of all, let me say that what central bankers think is not necessarily a justification for anything, but in this case, I don't deny that banks can create money. I say they do it all the time, and that part of their business, it doesn't cost real resources. It's covering the clearings that really matter, and money creation that is going to borrowers who are going to spend the money, that raises resource needs as a result of the expansion. But on the question of whether central bankers really are subscribing to the thin air theory in general, no, I don't think they are. I think that if they did, they wouldn't believe that controlling the quantity of reserves through monetary policy, even indirectly through interest rate regulation, would really constrain the growth of lending. And I think most central bankers think that by constraining, but certainly in pre abundant reserve arrangements, central bankers believe that the limits they put on reserve creation or the interest rates they set that determine the cost of reserves, we're putting constraints on lending by the rest of the banking system. And I think that view, they wouldn't subscribe to that view if they really weren't whole hog with the thin air view of banks' ability to create credit. So I don't think that they're all completely on board with the thin air view, even if they're not as entirely opposed to it as they might be.
In fact, I agree with that. And the intriguing thing about the Bank of England, I got a shock when that paper came out, even though I knew the authors. Okay, I met them, I think, in 2008, so I knew there were a couple of post-Keynesian economists working inside the Bank of England doing stock flow consistent modelling. What shock I got was the bank actually let them publish that paper, because the majority of bank staff are neoclassicals, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model builders. And I want to make one point here, but probably coming out of sequence. Maybe this is a left hook or a uppercut, I'm not sure. But the role of the neoclassical models of banking, what would you describe as the role of those models in macroeconomics?
What would I? I'm not sure that most of them are doing much work as far as what central bank practice is concerned.
Oh, no, I'm actually talking about people who accept money model MAR, accept loanable funds without making the clarifications you've made. So they effectively presume that banks, lend out of demand deposits, which is, we both know is false, but they're sloppy about it. But the end result is money multiplier model, loanable funds. What impact does that have on how you do macroeconomic modeling?
Well, I think the main result of that sort of thing is to downplay what I think is an endogenous aspect of money creation, because I'm not anti-endogenous money. I think that we have to be very careful about the ways in which money is endogenous. My whole theory of free banking is all endogenous money, but it's not the same kind.
Well, that's useful. That's a good point. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think the money supply can't be modeled too mechanically. I think that's.
But what actually happens in mainstream macroeconomics is those models, which we're both agreeing are fallacious in various ways, but they're accepted by the mainstream. That justifies the mainstream not including money or banks or debt in the macroeconomics. And the point of view that I take from the endogenous money perspective is that you have to include banks and debt and money in your macroeconomics, or you're not modeling capitalism.
Well, I think we probably both agree that for all kinds of reasons, these models don't really allow money any proper role.
Yeah,
I go back to, I used to lecture my students about Frank Hahn and all that stuff, and Clower and cash constraints, to create a real role for money, overlapping generations, which I always thought was terrible.
I agree.
So the fact of the matter is, it's not tractable. Even if you can try to put work money into these models, but doing it realistically, you end up complicating them so much. So that's that.
See, the point of that my approach is forget about neoclassical models. I'm a complete critic, as you could probably understand. You can build models of the macroeconomy involving banks and debt and money from the endogenous money point of view, and those models fit the data far more closely than the neoclassical models that leave it out completely, or models that argue that government controls of various forms, like reserve requirement controls and government money, money creation, that is supposed to drive what private banks do, And, I mean, look at the maths. I find that it simply doesn't fit the data in any realistic sense. So if you want to have money brought into macroeconomics, you end up with post-Keynesian endogenous money theory, not neoclassical loanable funds.
I agree with all of that, except I think you end up with free banking theory.
Well,
Mike,
I mean,
you had something to say there by the sounds of it. Mike, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think one way to, in my mind, summarize, why we are at where we are in the money, credit, and banking world is it's a path-dependent process. Why do we use QWERTY keyboards even when the layout of a Dvorak keyboard is much more efficient? Well, it comes from the old days with regular typewriters. If you were really fast, you'd jam up your keys, right? And you'd have to pick them out, so they purposely slowed you down. I don't have to do that anymore, but nobody uses a better, more efficient layout of keyboard keys. We use an inefficient technology. The economics profession, central banking, is a path-dependent system, meaning why do they do what they do? Because that's what they've always done. I mean, Jerome Powell's a lawyer by training. I think Christine Lagarde is as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. And, you get PhD economists in the central banks often rather than bankers. And they were trained a certain way. Why do they use the modeling tools they use? Because that's what they were taught by their professors, and that's what they were taught. And they don't lend themselves to adding more realistic assumptions and equations, so they just don't do it. Why? Well, they've gotten to where they are in life by not doing that. Thank you very much. I'm going to continue on my way. So they're kind of locked in, right? And it's hard to jar somebody out of a path-dependent process. How do you get them out? It takes some kind of crisis or revolution.
Yeah, that's true.
That's the history of our species, isn't it? Major system changes don't really happen voluntarily. Right. Sadly, we're not that organized.
So
there's a question there from one of the chatters, Gavin Yee. I'm just on a different system. It's not easy for me to see, but the question there is loanable funds theory is like commodity-based economy that only exists in barter. So there it is there. George or Steve or Mike, does anyone want to comment on that? That's a statement, not a question, but let's go with it.
Well, I will. I don't think that's true at all. As I said, my understanding of what the loanable funds theory is, or the theory that banks are intermediaries, is that banks are limited in their ability to extend credit by the real demand for their IOUs. That's the theory. So you don't have to say anything about barter. You don't have to abstract, certainly, from it being a monetary economy. You don't have to have visions of people delivering real goods to banks or even using cash, which is why I abstracted from that. It's all about whether the demand for bank IOUs limits the amount of lending that those banks can do in turn. That's the issue. Now, people might say, no, the real demand for bank IOUs doesn't constrain their ability to lend credit, and that's fine. That's the opposite. That's the different view. But my point is that the view I'm defending has nothing to do with abstracting from monetary exchange, bank deposits being used as money, and all that.
But this is what you're actually referring to the Kumhof paper in that particular element.
Yeah, because they treat the loanable funds theory as if it had to be real goods being delivered.
Well, no,
to
I think you've misread Michael's paper. Okay, I know Michael personally. We don't talk anymore because I wear a mask and he doesn't. Okay, literally stupid disagreement over COVID. He won't talk to me anymore, which I find ridiculous. But what he argued, he actually was a banker before he became an economist. He said he knows he created money. He did it for a living. And then when he's talking about the loanable funds model, what he's saying is the only way that it works is if banks act as if money is gravel. It's actually the example he uses. Somebody takes a lot of gravel, puts it into a bank, which is a warehouse. Somebody else borrows it, and therefore when it's taken out of the bank, it can't be used by anybody else, et cetera, et cetera. So it's his satire on what's necessary from a double entry bookkeeping point of view. It's not that he argues that's what loanable funds people believe, but he says effectively what he's saying is if you look at how, like for Krugman, for example, it's just more simplistic character than you on this particular front. If you look at how Krugman describes it, he's basically talking about his example of a baby co-op, where there's a central bank creating the money and people, the coupons for babysitting in Washington, which is the main example he uses of banking. This is again goes back to Dave's point, I think, about actually Mike's point about economists not going out and asking banks what they do. They're happy to use an example of a babysitting co-op rather than going and asking a bank what happens. But in his example, when somebody borrows the tokens from you, you can't use them. This is Krugman. Yeah. So what he's got is what Krugman's model effectively is effectively that there are tokens which you have to borrow from somebody else to be able to babysit, and so if the loan goes on, your tokens goes down, somebody else's rises. And what Michael is saying is when you apply that in the real world, what you've got to imagine is money is something like gravel. You're saying money is not its, and this is where I say the way you've defined the issue puts you in precisely the same definition that people who believe in Dodge's money accept, which is rare. You may have seen I took a look at another paper by Foer and Garbush, I think, where they tried to trash the model in a DS. They tried to trash Dodge's money. And that crazy assumption. They said loanable funds are simpler when there is no uncertainty. Therefore, with no loss of generality, we should use the simpler model. There's no uncertainty. Isn't that a lovely thing to know? We know the future. That's absurd.
Let me ask you a question, Steve, on this. But don't Jacob and Kumhoff, in their model of the loanable funds theory, don't they actually use the cartoon version as their model?
They say the only way it works is.
That's what I mean by saying that's how they are representing it. I mean, I took that to be more than a joke.
The point Michael made was, and Michael's a DSGE modeler, one of these crazy characters who writes masses of algebra for a couple of months before he can actually have a model he simulates. But when he did that, he said, okay, the only way it works is if it's like gravel, so I model it like gravel. But he said the real world is money is a promise to pay at the bank, whether the promises work both ways. As you say, it's a sort of two-directional loan. He said when you do it that way, you get money having real effects in macroeconomics. Now, this is the point of the contention. Why does it matter? And if the endogenous money case says that bank money creation affects aggregate demand and income, whereas the loanable funds effectively says we can model the macroeconomy without banks and debt and money because according to loanable funds, credit has no impact upon aggregate demand and income. Now, that's the main difference point. And it's also something you can test empirically, which is, I want to get onto that later.
I think there's a bit more in round two, and we're going to cover it right after mean tweets. But George, if you don't know, this is a segment we've made for Steve from all his fun. Let's have a look. What have we got, Steve?
Let's see.
No tweets yet, but there we go. Okay. No, that's a question from one of our chatters, is it? No, it's not. If it can make you feel better, Steve Keane doesn't really understand accounting either. Embarrassing that it's like this for both you and I can't read the other chatter actually, but it's okay to say it.
Yeah,
Blanchard. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, that's actually one I haven't seen, so thanks for finding that one for me. It's true, I didn't just understand accounting until I built Minsky. And then, in fact, when I first built Minsky, I had effectively, you could have single entry or even triple entry on a single line when I first built Minsky. And when I realized, when we started developing it to the stage where we actually had double entry, I realized my vision of accounting was wrong. And that's 14 years ago. So I think I'm caught up since then.
Very good. All right, what's the next one? Keane did a kickstart of some Cocker's name project years ago. I sent him it, and I think He must have pocketed it. What do you think, Steve?
I wish I had. I wouldn't be feeling broke right now. That's what helped build Minsky. And I don't believe this bastard for an instant that he actually gave me any money. I'd like to see his email because I could check the emails and see whether he had. I think I call bullshit on him putting any money into it. But the cockamamie project exists. It's called Minsky. You can download it from SourceForge. It's open source. It's free. And next week, quite possibly, I'll be launching a commercial product built on top of it. So thanks for your money, Handel.
And finally, this Steve guy is a quack. Of course, fractional reserve banking increases the money supply. That's the entire point of it.
Yeah, it's a great little model. If only it existed in the real world, it might work. But when you do the double entry bookkeeping, you find the only way that you can actually have banks lending out reserves is if all reserves are in cash. You can build a much more complicated model where there's an electronic system for the banks and a physical one for banks. But unless private banks lend in cash, the money multiplier does not work. Now, when's the last time you got a loan in cash? George's specialty of the pre-banking period may well still be relevant for the money multiplier, but it ain't the real world today. Hasn't been for at least 40 years.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay.
Thanks for clearing that up. Look, while I'm here, I'm just going to plug Planksip, actually. Planksip.org, one of our sponsors. As a philosophy and culture media outlet, Planksip helps emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Now, I was going to also plug my own business, which is a sponsor, BFB, Business Film Booth. But I realized in my notes, I just cut and pasted what Ty put in for me, and all Ty put was, Dave, put your shit here. So So I haven't got a thoughtful thing of my business. I will get round to plugging my business at some point. But for now, let's get back to round two still, because I think there was a bit more to unpack there. And I don't mind, George, if you pick up perhaps on what was on your mind before we cut away.
Oh, but goodness, after all those
nasty
little remarks, I can't remember where we left off.
I do have a question for George.
Go for it.
Yeah.
So George, when you say that the constraint on the banks in their creation of money is the demand for their IOUs, what ultimately is behind that demand? Is there a trend in a cycle? The trend being, say, demographics, and the cycle being, Julia borrowed and bought the car and now doesn't need a car for another 5 years?
No, it's the demand in practice. The demand for bank IOUs is just the same thing as what economists talk about as the demand for real money balances, the demand for media of exchange. The fact is that people need a certain amount of these assets that can be used in exchange, and they hold on to bank IOUs to the extent that they need an inventory of exchange media. That's not the same as demanding a loan from a bank. That's different. Julia borrowed money from the bank, and we mentioned the special case where she held on to it, which would be one where she was as if she needed more exchange media to have on hand just in case. But usually people borrow from banks in order to go out and buy other stuff. But other people, and sometimes the same people, want to add to their balances of exchange media. We all have a certain demand for the stuff. It tends to be positively related to overall economic activity, transactions, productions, and all that. But at other times, people want to hoard more or hoard less, and that's it. So the demand for money is really the same thing as the demand for bank deposits. Again, setting aside cash, right? Cash is the one kind of money people could also demand that's not bank deposits, but it's small beer. So that's what I mean by the demand.
So without a growing, in the case of a non-growing population, then it would just be taste and preferences as a change for keeping a little more on hand. And
Yes.
What I typically buy is X, so I need so much money for transactional purposes.
That's right. Yeah. And you don't, money doesn't, bank deposits are crummy investment. They hardly earn any interest. So people tend to not have a whole lot of those and tend to limit their accumulation to what they need for regular purchasing. And the rest of their savings go to other things. That is, the rest of their savings, they don't have banks intermediate them as they do in my theory for their monetary savings. The rest they put in mutual funds or unit trusts and whatever, or stocks. So it's only a small part of people's savings that takes the form of holding money or accumulating bank IOUs that in turn, I say, does determine how much lending banks can do in turn. All this, by the way, is subject to how many reserves the central banks are creating. And they throw a big wrench in the works. So let me make it clear, if central banks make reserves more abundant directly or by setting lower interest rates, this can allow bank lending to depart, to grow independently of people wanting to hold on to more bank IOUs. And that's one of the most important ways in which banks aren't always perfect intermediaries. It's the central banks can really throw a wrench in the works or upset what would be an intermediation equilibrium.
Jump in there, Steve.
Now I want to come in here because you've made an empirical claim there, George.
Yes.
Okay. You've claimed that if central banks create too much reserves, there'll be inflation.
I didn't say inflation, but that is one possible, one likely concept.
Now, can I share my screen, please? Can I share my screen? This is taking off the gloves here. Is that possible?
I know what's coming, Steve. You're going to talk about the transition
the
to the floor
duster.
system and interest on reserves. And that's a very special change. Yeah.
Come again?
No, you're going to show a chart of how much reserves have grown since 2008, right?
I'm going to show two things. I'm going to go right back to, what am I going back to? That's to 1950. So previous. Okay. So if I can actually, hopefully this will work. I'm not using my own software. I'm using the Federal Reserve's. So how do I go about sharing a screen here? I've got disable camera turning up, but not share screen. Can anybody help me out here? Yeah, I can only just. I'm not getting the right. Okay, what I've done. I can't show it, unfortunately, by the looks of it, unless you can work out a way to share my screen, Dave. If you look at
middle button, Steve.
Middle button. Three dots.
Middle circle button at the bottom.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Pardon me. I didn't have the full.
There's three dots, and you've got share screen pops up, or in the pop up you can see it.
Oh, bloody hell!
I see the three dots. It's on your own little screen.
On my
little
window.
So if you got
the one that shows
I see. I got you.
Yourself.
Okay.
Speaker and camera, and then
video settings.
No, you've gone too far.
Do you see 5 circles at the bottom of your screen? 5 circles, the middle one.
I've got it.
How about if I figure it out, I get to put my picture up?
Yeah, I reckon.
You do. I'm trying to find. Hang on,
I'm now thinking what I can share.
I'm getting neat. I can't see the buttons you guys are talking about. They're not actually.
These are the conversations my kids have with me. Dad,
okay.
You don't have any.
This is why I don't allow it. Ty just said he doesn't allow it. Okay, put up with it. There was when you try to get a relationship between reserves or change in reserves and inflation over the last 60 years, you find bugger all, nothing at all. Okay, there is no relationship. And the most dramatic period of reserve creation, as we all agree here, we all know, was after the financial crisis in 2007, 2008.
Yes,
the rate of increase of reserves that time was 4 million% was the maximum rate. 4 million. And what happened to the rate of inflation? It fell.
Yes, but there's a huge but here, Steve.
What's the but?
I've written a whole book about the but. Then 2008, October 2008, the Fed and some other central banks around the same time started paying interest on reserves. That makes a huge difference to the demand for reserves. Essentially, reserves, unlike in the past, became a more attractive asset since then than many other short-term assets, including short-term treasuries. So now banks accumulate reserves quite passively in real reserves, not just nominal. Of course, they have to hold all the nominal reserves that are created in any system. But in this case, the real demand for reserves tends to grow with the supply. That's a very special circumstance. And I also want to step back a little bit and say, even before 2008, I wasn't asserting a strict quantitative relationship or quantity theory relation between reserve creation and inflation. I don't subscribe to any such naive theory. My only claim was if central banks create enough reserves, then that will tend to cause lending to exceed savings, or the demand for IOUs of the private banking sector, and then you will get inflation.
And
So
that's
it's
another
not that
empirical claim, which I wish I could show you. It's
yeah.
100%
I can show you some cases where that has happened,
Well, I
where
think
you have reserve growth and prices rise as a result. I have a paper on it for what it's worth.
Well, I have to take a look at it. But when I look in the data, I don't find anything like that. What I find is reserves and credit creation virtually independent of each other. And the one time when the central banks rapidly, and the whole reason for the central banks, particularly the Fed, and you can find this by reading their minutes, as I'm sure you've had access to,
Yes.
the Federal Reserve actually worried that the level of reserve creation under QE would cause inflation. That was their concern.
Anybody who made that argument then didn't understand how the system worked. I was quite shocked at how many people thought that QE was going to be inflationary, but they didn't understand it.
The trouble is, they're people in charge of the monetary system. We're talking
I'm
Bernanke.
not happy with it. I'm not happy with that.
This is a product of the ignorance neoclassical economists have about money creation. And this is one reason. Like, I'm glad you've got one foot on our side of the border. So I'm pleased you've got it there.
A lot of people were way behind the learning curve on what was how things had radically changed after 2008. It was actually quite embarrassing.
But I think I was wrong before 2008 as well. They've been embarrassing for 60 years.
They were less wrong.
They're still wrong. I mean, the thing, once you look at how money is created, the private banking system, whether it's a free banking or whether it's one with a Federal Reserve as part of the system, bank money creation adds to aggregate demand and income. And therefore, you've got to, and that forget about whether it's real or nominal, it's both. So you have the bank money creation affects the level of demand in the economy and the level of income, and it causes booms and busts. And that's what the post-Keynesian group that I'm part of course, have been arguing for 60 years. And
that's funny, but I agree with all of that.
Well, you're in our camp then. You're an endogenous money man.
But
you've heard it here first.
To that extent,
ending the live stream.
But if you say that bank money creation it contributes to aggregate demand, other things equal, which I certainly think is correct, then why can't it also contribute, if there's enough of it, to inflation?
It can, absolutely.
Oh, okay. But that's
totally, yeah. And in fact, mainly to asset price inflation. And this is one reason I predicted the global financial crisis before it happened. Because being somebody who's followed Hyman Minsky's work, I've always seen credit demand as being a major cause of the booms and busts in the capitalist economy. And when I looked at the level of credit creation, it was so high compared to historical norms. The level of private debt was so high. I said, this trend can't continue. When the trend falls, there has to be a downturn. And that because it was an exponential increase in the ratio of debt to income. If you look back at if you look at the Federal Reserve data, which now the Bank of International Settlements does a better job of collecting than the Fed, or publishing than the Fed does, you see an exponential increase in the ratio of private debt to GDP, going on right from 1946 right through to 2007. And looking at that trend in 2005, I said this can't be sustained. It has to reverse direction. When it does, there'll be a crisis, and probably the biggest since the Great Depression, which is precisely what happened. But the only way you can see that is by saying credit demand adds to aggregate demand and income. Now, the main loanable funds arguments, which you're not putting forward, and I'm pleased about that, the main loanable funds is a transfer of spending power between one group and another group, which Bernanke called a pure redistribution. Okay, so therefore not a creation of money. And he said pure redistributions should have no significant macroeconomic effects. Now, you look at the data, and that's screamingly false. When I do a correlation, and again, I can't show my screen, but I can't find those dots here somewhere. When you look at the correlation between credit, which is, I define credit as change in private debt, credit and unemployment, the correlation is virtually minus 0.9, when you go from 1990 to 2015. So there's a dramatic impact of credit creation on employment demand. Both sides of the 2008 event. It's not something I only find after 2008. That correlation between 1990 and 2015. This is before reserves became income-earning assets for the private banks. So credit demand is an essential part of macroeconomics. And the whole argument of the loanable funds argument in general, not the way you're putting it, but the way neoclassicals put it forward, is to say they don't have to worry about money. They can model capitalism as a barter system. Now, we're saying you can't. You must include money and banks and debt to model capitalism. And I think you're doing that to some extent, but I think you've got some of your empirical guesses are wrong.
I do have the wrong tree, but let me just say, at the risk of sounding like I'm agreeing with you too much, first of all, I think, I think that the behavior of nominal or aggregate demand is extremely important in business cycles. I believe that too little of it causes busts. I believe that too much of it eventually causes busts. And when I say that banks are intermediaries, I don't want to at all have people think that I think they're perfect intermediaries, because if that were true, their credit creation activities would never contribute to busts of either sort. And I don't believe that. I don't believe it at all. And I have a long section, as you know, Steve, in my paper of the special circumstances in which intermediation fails to be perfect. So including, and this I think where we do disagree, I think that the central bank policies have are the most important reason why we have these departures from proper intermediation. But they're not the only reason. They're not the only. Banking crises are another reason, obviously. So my view of banks as intermediaries isn't at all meant to erase the business cycle, if you will, or the role of credit creation or lack thereof in the business cycle. There I have, I want to plead innocent on that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's the important point, because the main way that loanable funds is used is to argue you can ignore the banking system. Neoclassicals use loanable funds to say there's no need to model the monetary system in doing macroeconomics. Now, the point of view of the endogenous money people, the reason we put this together, we say it's critical. If you don't have the banking system in your model, you're not modeling capitalism.
Well, the reason why we don't disagree that much here, Steve, is because even though I don't call myself a member of the Austrian School of Economics, I do know that school. I've had a great deal of intimate contact with it. And certainly that school also shares a lot in common with Minsky on viewing credit creation, excessive credit creation, particularly, a little less so in deficient credit creation. And here I think the Austrians understate the importance of that as factors in the business cycle. It's their bread and butter on business cycle theory. So there's an overlap there that I think explains why we're not disagreeing a lot on this stuff.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, for example, if you probably, I've forgotten who Minsky was trained both by Schumpeter. He did his PhD. Yes. So Schumpeter is the Austrians.
That's the connection. That's the connection.
Not the only one. There's actually two. I've forgotten the other person, but another co-supervisor he had was genuine Austrian economist, but more an evolution.
Was it Rupke? It wasn't Rupke.
I've forgotten who it was. I can't remember, but it was another Austrian. So there's, but the Austrians argued getting the rate of interest wrong is what causes the problems. The post-Keynesian argued the sheer volume of money which is created that causes the booms and the busts. And this is where we're working with bankers like Richard Vague, for example, somebody I recommend you take a look at. A successful banker has now become a critic of excessive private debt. And what he argues that the banks heard, the vision that the Austrians have of the banking sector is, and I'm going to be probably a bit too satirical about it, but the argument goes, well, if a bank offers too much of a rate of interest, other people say, oh, that can't possibly work. That bank's going to go bust. I'll bank with the more responsible bank that offers me a low rate of interest. I call bollocks. People just go for the harsh returns, and banks themselves also do the same thing. So there's a Richard Vague, the person I really have a look at some of his work. You'd find it very useful, even if you don't agree with his orientation, because there's a huge amount of historical research he's got a research team doing for him. So very, very worthwhile work. But Richard was a banker in the 1980s in Texas. And the reason he became an independent banker was he was running the consumer division of a private bank in Texas. All of the banks were lending to the oil industry. Massive numbers of rigs were going up everywhere. And the reason was, of course, oil had risen from $10 a barrel to $40 a barrel. They all lent to put more rigs in there. Too many rigs were built. The price crashed from $40 down to $5. And these banks had to then sell their profitable divisions. And that's where Richard managed to buy out the consumer division and become a banker in his own right. So he says herding occurs. Banks are irresponsible. Banks lend on the latest trends. And that boom and bust cycle that banks then cause, independent of the rate of interest, it's all the volume of credit they're extending. That's what causes the main booms and slumps in capitalism.
Mike,
so I have
jump in there.
Go
ahead.
Please.
No. Mike, I saw you about to jump in.
Sorry.
So go ahead. Sorry.
No, just a quick thought experiment, circling back to something I had previously suggested. And so, imagine, if you would, a long weekend. Maybe it's a 5-day work week, where, I don't know, George, Steve get together at a neutral site. Maybe I'm there. Maybe there's a banker or two who should join the group, and some select others. Maybe it's on the order of 8 people or whatever, and you spend time building a model. It's a basic model. It has a monetary authority, a fiscal authority, a business sector, household sector, commercial banking sector, and all of the real economic interactions and the financial interactions, including backroom clearing and what have you, are explicitly laid out. I would imagine that George and Steve would agree on most of the equations and most of the relationships, and it would be quite interesting to see where they disagreed, right? Mm-hmm. And if it couldn't be resolved, you just run the model both ways. Steve's way and George's way, what if, experiments. And it will resolve a lot of what we're talking about here, I think. We would get down to the few issues where there's disagreement, and it's an empirical issue to resolve it, or just there's no way at the moment to resolve it. You just run the model 2 different ways.
I think
we'd be doing stuff like that.
A good place to end round 2, but I think from what you've been talking about, there is going to be a way for you to explore the actual differences between the two of you in this last round. If you're finding you're agreeing far too much, kind of that, right? So
yeah, we've got to cut it out.
Before I do, I'm just going to just plug Steve's Substack and Patreon. Actually, it's a critical look at economics from a professor of economics. For more, join his Patreon page, patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, where most posts are free access and no paywall. But the third round, I wanted to see what Steve and then what George thinks would be an ideal system of banking and loaning, what it would look like, presuming we don't have one already, which sounds like we don't. So how would it respond better than the current system in a crisis? And I'm hoping there might be a link here for George from loanable funds to the productive norm and what he calls good deflation.
Productivity norm.
Productivity norms.
Okay.
The productivity norm and what he calls good deflation versus bad deflation. So, George, start with you, if you don't mind. What would be an ideal system? And then we'll move on to Steve.
Well, before I can talk about an ideal system, I'll say what the ideal outcome needs to be, in my opinion. And that is that you want a system that keeps aggregate demand growing steadily. And in a productivity norm, to explain what that means, aggregate demand grows just enough over time to keep up with growth of factor input. That's the growth of your labor supply and also capital. So you don't have to have wage deflation, particularly wage rate deflation, which is the worst kind to have to make an economy put up with. So you have aggregate demand growing at this rate that keeps up with factor input. Now, what that means and what it has to do with productivity is that if productivity is growing rapidly under this system, inflation will tend to go down, and could even be negative. You could actually have goods costing less if factors become productive enough. But if factors are getting scarce, you let inflation go up. That is, you allow supply side factors to allow inflation. So that's my ideal. And that ideal does fit into the notion of a perfect, of an ideal equilibrating banking system, because the only way you're going to have nominal spending grow evenly is if, when people are trying to accumulate bank money, the banks are responding by making more loans, right? That way, savings through the banking system are offset by more lending through the banking system, and that's going to mean that the banking system isn't causing the flow of spending to shrink or to grow excessively, keeping it on this desirable trend. So thus the ideal, that's how it fits into intermediation. Now, I'm not saying that intermediation is perfect, but I'm saying why we want it to be perfect to contribute to this overall result. My theory, which is what I wrote my first book about an embarrassingly long time ago, is that in a free banking system where you have no reserve requirements, you have no central bank that mucks around with the supply of reserves in an undesirable way, where, let's imagine you have an institution, you can call it a night watchman central bank, only lets the supply of reserves grow at a steady rate equal to that factor input rate. The banking system will take care of the changes in velocity or demand for money balances to supplement that, and the overall result will be the desirable growth in a steady growth of nominal earnings and spending and income and all that avoids business cycles and allows the economy to grow. There's my ideal. I don't think it's ever going to happen, mind you, but that is what I argued in that book and elsewhere. Free banking was conducive towards, if you'd only let it do its thing.
Now, Steve, do you want to comment on that first, or would you like to just outline your ideal, and then we can get critiques on both?
Well, I mean, I think I made my comment in my paper that the only thing that economists I've ever seen bankers worry about in terms of shortages is a shortage of cocaine. I've seen, particularly like since '87, that's when I started getting involved with bankers and share market speculators and options traders and so on. And but there's a lot of racket. Is that coming through my side, or there's something else causing noise disturbances elsewhere? I'll leave it if it's just me. Looks like it's just me. Okay.
Yeah, I think so, Steve. I can't hear it.
That's good. Okay, just clarifying. What I find is banks lend into asset bubbles, and if you have banks being able to do whatever they want to do, because they can create money by double entry bookkeeping, they will lend into an asset bubble that will cause the asset bubble to continue inflating. And then when they get to the point where there's not enough people who are willing to come in and take out additional loans to maintain the asset bubble, you have a boom. You have a crash coming out of it as well. So that's the nature of banking when they're allowed to do whatever they want to do. I would like to restrict lending to banks. That banks lend for the main reasons would be working capital for corporations, finance for consumer loans when what the item being bought by the consumer is too big for them to buy directly out of income. That's things like houses and cars, and lending to entrepreneurs to enable entrepreneurs to establish new businesses. Okay, that's what I'd like to see banks restricted to. What they've ended up doing is financing asset bubbles. We have them financing house purchases. That's what gave us the subprime boom and bust in America. We have the same thing happening pretty much globally. The banks will lend for an asset. They will not lend against a cash flow or a business idea. So I think we've got a very, very bad form of lending coming out of the fact that effectively neoclassical economists, not George here, I've got to say, but neoclassical economists expect banks to behave well. And they're basically, we should deregulate and it'll work better. Now, by deregulation, what we've ended up with is a system where banks fundamentally finance asset bubbles, and we get booms and busts out of that. We haven't had them financing entrepreneurs, You can't get money from a bank for love nor money, for good reason, because banks could lose money on entrepreneurs, but you don't get money for working capital anymore. So banks, or the endogenous money theory from a post-Keynesian point of view, was heavily begun by Basil Moore back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And Basil's example of bank lending and why it was unconstrained were lines of credit. And lines of credit were negotiated by large corporations with sometimes dozens of banks so that they could meet any change in demand without needing to go and ask for another loan. Now, lines of credit no longer exist. They weren't profitable enough for banks. They've shut them down. That's why I've now got the commercial paper market where banks, where corporations like General Motors, for example, issue short-term notes that enable them to get money to pay wages. And one of the reasons why there was such fear about the crash in 2008 was the commercial market, paper market collapsed, because guess which company dominated it? Lehman Brothers. So we have enormous needs, I think, for controls on what banks do, because the fact that they can create money and that then causes booms and busts in the economy means that if you have them totally deciding what to do in private, you'll end up with asset bubbles. You won't end up with them financing productive investment. And just like George, that's what I want to see banks financing, productive investment. But I don't trust them to do it without controls on their behavior.
Might a simpler way of controlling the banks, rather than giving a laundry list of things they're allowed to lend to, is to require them to service any loans that they make, rather than packaging them up
that's
and
also a danger.
them.
Yeah,
because that's in the old days. That was the concern. When I bought my first house in 1985, I had to put on a suit and go stand before a loan committee of 12 old guys.
12
in a dark conference room, and they grilled me and they said, we're evaluating your character. Basically, they wanted to know, am I going to pay them back with interest on time? And then they said, thank you, we'll let you know. And then I had to go back into that room with these people, and they said, well, given the fact that you're a professor and we have decided to grant you the loan for your home. But they had a service that, they were on the hook if I went south on them. But when you can offload it, package it up and offload it, and it's not your problem anymore, I think that's where you tend to get into bubbles.
If I can respond a little bit on some of the points Steve made. First of all, I'm the last one to apologize for the way modern banking systems operate. That's why I like to think about alternative arrangements. But I disagree with the general idea that the reason why banking systems are so bad is because the governments don't regulate them enough. The fact of the matter is that we can speak of any number of banking systems and in any number of countries that have proved to operate very badly with all manner of regulations in place. I'm not sure what the hypothetical adequately regulated banking system is that doesn't have any crises, but I'm sure no one has come up with one yet.
No, but
right?
I'll give you one of my favorite examples. Bill White is a good friend of mine. Bill White, who was
I like Bill. I know Bill.
He's a great bloke. Yeah, and I was with him with a conference seminar. I think it was in Berlin, and the Basel III rules were being explained. Of course, he was there for Basel II, and he leaned across to me on the table and said, "When the rules for Basel II came across my desk, my heart sank." And what we're doing, we've got the wrong people making the regulations. We've got neoclassical economists writing regulations. They haven't got a fucking clue how the banking system operates.
Regulations, that's my point, is there are a lot of bad regulations out there. Yeah. And the reason I got interested in free banking was because of the fact that a lot of the better banking systems and with better records in the past were in fact ones without very heavy-handed regulations. The Canadian is one of the better known, the Scottish system, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I say all this recognizing that we're talking about a long time ago, and we're not talking about things that are easily recreated by any means. So this is very pie in the sky. But the fact is that the reason these systems worked well is because they didn't have really bad regulations. Well,
Yeah.
and that's important. Too many people forget that when governments intervene, they often fuck up. If I don't know if you have to edit that, but that's
no,
what they do.
we don't like people saying fuck
live.
on this program. I'm sorry.
Oh, all
Fuck is
right.
the word
Well,
we
I'm
ban fuck. We
terribly-
ban fuck regularly. Yeah.
I'm terribly sorry, but
yeah.
anyway, there is a reason for considering, first of all, getting rid of the bad regulations or trying to not have those. The other point I want to make by way of a little pushback is I did do a study myself called Bank Lending Manias in Theory and History, which was published somewhere, the Journal of Financial Services Research, just a long time ago. And I looked into quite a few of the most famous so-called bank lending manias. This is where you have the herding, supposedly had the herding effects. And I looked at what was driving bank lending in all these famous cases. It wasn't exhaustive, mind you, but just some of the more well-known ones that I was aware of and could get data from. And in all of them, it was the high-powered reserve base that was driving things. You didn't have a big expansion. In most cases, you had no expansion at all in the total amount of bank credit being created relative to the growth of reserves. That may have changed, and I'm sure people could come up with counterexamples, but for what it's worth, I looked at a bunch of famous ones, and that's what I found, including Australia's big boom and bust in the 1890s.
There's actually a great paper on that, but you may not have seen it, by O'Brien, I think it is, and Clark and O'Brien, I think it is, 2000, very, very good paper by the Reserve Bank. And they describe that as the 1890s is worse for Australia than the 1930s were. So it's quite a useful paper. I'd also recommend looking at Richard Vague's work in his The Paradox of Debt, and I've forgotten the previous book, but he's actually got his research staff to look at 150 crises over the last 1.5 centuries in the 7 major economies. And he identifies all of them as being due to credit busts, not what's happened with on the reserve side. But that's something we I appreciate the work you're doing anyway, George. Let's get that said. One of the main arguments can I just finish this one,
sure,
Dave, quickly? One of the main arguments I saw about what is effectively a bad regulation, but it's more than a regulation, was allowing banks to have a limited liability. Because if you look back at those Scottish banks, if it was unlimited liability, if you made bad loans, you went belly up. And
for some of them, yes. For some had unlimited. Yeah. And a lot of banks historically had double liability. It was very common, and they wiped it out when they created deposit insurance in the United States. They said, we don't need that anymore. I think they made a big mistake.
And what they do is that encourages irresponsible behavior by the banks. And I quite agree with you on that front.
Can I get you, George, to read out our top chatters this week? This will be fun. We were expected to get it completely perfect without any stumbles, of course.
Which one?
Coming up in a moment.
On the screen in a moment.
Oh, okay.
So just read them from any way you like, first list and second list and third list, and as fast as you possibly can.
Okay.
Tradition.
Okay, we have A. Ben Derrigay, Tony Wilson, Economics in One Lesson, Interactive Research, Tomás Surdej, Michael de Souza Cruz, John Watson, Shumisking, DR, Blue Boy, D. Bruce, Danny, Joe Polito and Wall, Nadia Yvette, Teddy Brusky, and Frankly, Bob Leor, Adrian Terry, Thomas Darlington, Jay Gordy, Michael Newman, J85 Grimm, Dinner with Franklin, Web Freaks, Happy Dude Rower, David Collins, Caruso Roby, Rob, Botched Mandela, East London Crocodiles, Scout Johnson, Tom Kopp, Michael D. Smith, Cosmic Blaze, Paul Ranjit Kumar, Alex Marshall, Samuel Orgy, Dan, Thomas Sickveland, Rob Pierce, Daniel Lydall, and Chris Hammond.
Well done.
Yeah, nailed it, definitely. Okay.
Yeah, definitely nailed it. Well done. Well, we're getting close towards the end here, and I guess I wanted to. There was a question that came up in the chatters just before, which I think to be fair, you've all covered it to some degree, but maybe just to be clearer about the connection. The question was from Bill Goggin, it was a while back, but it was where does fiscal fit in this? It wasn't quite that. It was like there's no mention of fiscal, but you guys have actually, but not overtly. So I just wondered if there's any link to the fiscal side of things, because we often talk about or hear a lot about the public, the deficit and so on, but not about private debt nearly as much as we should, which seems to be the bigger problem, at least, Steve, going by your account, and leads to bubbles. So, I don't think the question will be found easily, but it was basically where does fiscal? There's no mention of fiscal in this discussion.
Yeah.
There is, I know. Any of you care to take on that?
That's a bit. George defined the terms of the discussion by talking about the endogenous money theory as it relates to private bank money creation.
Yeah.
So I'm quite happy to leave it at that level. This is where the modelling, and George, I'd really twist your arm to download Minsky and try to lay out your ideas in Minsky with the double entry bookkeeping tables, because that. But the difference is, what you would not be aware of, is that it's a top-down model. So if you want to build a model with 37 banks, you've got to define the 37 banks yourself. So it's a top-down model. It's not a multi-agent build from the bottom-up model. But it would let you look at what the logical monetary flows are at the aggregate level. And then if you want to work really hard, you can make a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 37 bank model.
I think you're trying to get me to buy that program, aren't you?
It's free. Sorry, mate. Gotcha.
Okay. I can't accuse you of that. All right, fine. I'll look into it. I promise.
Good.
So the modern monetary theorists typically will conceive of the public sector as having a fiscal authority and a monetary authority, and then they work together hand in hand. They are not independent of one another. And so when the Treasury does something in the U.S., the Fed has to respond to whatever's happening. So
Donald Trump doesn't seem to
policy
think
and
so.
monetary policy are intertwined.
Yeah. I did. By the way, all this started when I read the Bank of England paper, and I wasn't at all thinking about modern monetary theory when I started writing my critique. Of course, I recognize there's some overlap. I think that I think it's important to recognize the difference between reasoning as if the Fed and Treasury were just one unit, which is interesting and leads to useful thought experiments and some good ideas, perhaps. But it's important to distinguish between that hypothetical case and the reality, where there is a certain difference between them, and they are not perfectly coordinating. And that means that has certain implications that shouldn't be ignored. You can say that it oughtn't to be the case that they aren't perfectly working together, or they aren't one unit, but they are, and that has some implications. It does constrain government spending somewhat more than it would be if there were simply a Treasury-Fed combo. And there are a number of reasons for this, but they have to do with the fact that the Fed doesn't allow the Treasury to overdraw its TGA account, for example. By the way, I think it should be allowed to overdraw it under certain circumstances, but it can't. That makes it a little bit difficult for the Treasury to spend as much as it wants to without having to tax or otherwise add to the TGA account sometimes, and taxation is one way of doing that. So there are some differences that need to be recognized. How important they are, well, that would be a big discussion, I suppose, and would take us pretty far from talking about banks and intermediation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's built into the assumptions, I think, behind a lot of this, isn't it? It's a question of perhaps worldviews, what is implicit in some of the ideas that are here, especially with London funds. So I think that's what I saw in the chat. There was some patterns there just about asking of what happens at the larger level. But you're right. Let's keep it to just this level. So
I saw something in the chat, if I may, Dave. I want to respond to it because somebody posted it a few times. They're asking what about the free banking experiment under Pinochet in Chile? And I just want to respond to that by saying I have no idea what they're talking about. There was a free banking episode in Chile. I think it was way back in the 1870s, I think that's rather before Pinochet. That's the only one I know about, for what it's worth. Anyway, I wanted to point that out to whoever asked that question.
I hadn't seen about that either, but it's obviously somebody says there's a book about it, Miracle Cure, by George Palace. So I might go searching for that.
Wasn't the Milton Friedman and the boys from Chicago allegedly helping them back in the 80s?
Friedman, there were several Chicago boys who were involved in that government. That is, they trained at Chicago. Friedman's role was actually pretty minor. He gave a talk there. Sebastian Edwards has a whole book about this, where he sorts out who did what and all that. And of course, it's not an easy question. What role? When should economists consult, if ever, with dictators? Is a good question. I'll just leave it at that. I can say that I haven't consulted with any, but I'm afraid I have to admit, none of them have asked me to consult.
Worked out.
Yeah,
you don't have a good test of my ethics.
Yeah, my dictatorship portfolio is pretty minor as well, unfortunately.
Well, it's kept you out of trouble, at least on that score.
Yeah.
Very good. Any final thoughts, George? If things bubbled up in your head as we've been talking, that perhaps you've gone, I haven't quite got to talking about that. Is there anything that's come up that you thought was an interesting avenue that we haven't discussed?
Oh, goodness. Well, I suppose there's all kinds of things we could keep on discussing, but I nothing stood out as something I'm dying to get off my chest that I haven't. No, I think I put in my 2 cents, but I'm happy if we can answer some more questions from the audience and that sort of thing. I think we want to give them a chance.
That would be good to go.
I don't have any answers for all the insults that I
no, exactly.
in the feed. I have nothing to say about that.
Do you want to read out the one that's just coming through now from Tony Wilson? Does it matter what Roman coins and does it matter what Roman coins were minted from? Caesar had them minted, and he then had to spend them so that they could be in circulation, and he could then tax people. I think it's a fiscal kind of thing, but nonetheless,
that's a fiscal question. Yeah.
So I don't think it relates to loanable funds.
Yeah, my knowledge of coinage is all concentrated on the Industrial Revolution, which is when I wrote a book about that. I'll tell you a story about it very quickly. One of the people I ended up getting to know very well as a result of that project was Richard Doty. He was the numismatic curator at the Smithsonian, so that was a big deal. Well, at one point, Richard said, "George, I want you to take my job." And this is true. I said, "Richard, are you kidding? I don't know anything about coins except the ones that my book is about. The numismatists out there would chew me up and spit me out in a heartbeat." So, of course, I didn't throw my hat in the ring, and I didn't know at the time he was dying of cancer.
Oh, dear.
And I wouldn't have been any good at that job, of course. But I mention it because it's one of the nicest compliments anyone has ever paid me, that he thought that my research on the book was good enough that I could fake being a numismatist at the Smithsonian.
It's a backhanded compliment, but take it.
Yeah, no, I did. I was tickled by it. I'm sorry. I was sorry about the circumstances, though.
Mike, your closing thoughts. I haven't had you included as much as maybe I'd like, but because the main argument, or the thrust of the arguments between Steve and George. But what's your thoughts now that you've been listening to all of this? What comes to mind?
Well, I think the general public, I think a lot of politicians, maybe even people at the Fed, have incorrect mental models about how the system works. I think they think about national governments and banking systems and what have you, like they think of their household budget regarding deficits, and my paycheck comes in, there's a pot of money, then I spend it and what have you. And it's very hard for the average person to think differently from that. It's kind of the fallacy of composition, that what's true for the individual parts is not necessarily true for the whole. That's why we have macroeconomics. And I can remember one story told me by a prominent modern monetary theorist that he spent a half a day with a very well-known at the time politician. This person even ran for president, big shot in Washington. And he said, at the end, this politician understood absolutely everything they had shown him about how the real banking system works. And so as they were parting, they said, "You're going to go to Washington now and spread the word, right?" And he said, "Are you out of your minds? The headlines will read, so-and-so says deficits don't matter." He says, "I'll be crucified. This is really interesting, but I can't do anything with this." So
and that's one of, yeah.
It was odd because Cheney got away with saying it. Cheney said it, but it had a different context, apparently.
Yeah, this is the problem, though.
We path dependent,
Yeah, we have false models of money creation and banking and everything else, believed by the public, believed by politicians, even if you get them to understand what the system is, they don't want to talk about it. They want to get embarrassed. So we get what John Kenneth Galbraith brilliantly described as conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom means we have a totally false model of how the system operates, and we don't dare disturb that totally false model. And on that point, that's why people like myself have gone into the endogenous money model. We know it describes the actual structure of the accounting of banking. And we think, for God's sake, stop promulgating false models. And that's where you and I will ultimately differ, George, because I think you're trying to keep alive what I see as a false paradigm, which is loanable funds. I'm trying to bring what I see as a correct paradigm, which is the banks create money and have very little restriction on what they can do out of the current system of reserves.
Well, that's fair. And, Steve, as you know, many in the audience may not. This debate that we're having is very, very old.
Extremely old, 200 plus years, yeah.
That's right. So, and probably, if I don't miss my guess, neither of us is going to end up settling it.
No, definitely not.
It's going to be happening again and again. Every once in a while, you get some people doing just what we're doing. Tobin went at the people back in the 60s who were saying banks are not intermediaries, and he said they were, and then you had the clash a bit before that. So this has been going on a long, long time, and then maybe that there's some fundamental sense in which it can't be resolved. But but there will always be people like me and people like you who are absolutely convinced that one side is right and that the other one is wrong. And I guess the best we can do is give people the raw material to decide which of those sides they want to take.
Well, that's one reason I designed Minsky.
CBDCs might tip things in Steve's favor. A comment there from one of the chatters. I was having that in the back of my mind. I didn't know.
Not really. Central bank digital currencies would mean that individuals have accounts at the central bank, and that would actually, in some ways, eliminate the importance of reserves.
Work the other way.
I don't think it's going to actually happen anyway. I actually want CDBCs to be created because I think we're going to need government money creation when the ecological crisis hits us really badly. I think the private credit system is going to collapse, and in that system, the only monetary system we're going to have left is government money creation. And we better have lots of it because we need to create enormous amounts of resources to have any chance of turning around the damage we're doing to the climate. I think that's equally. I'm flying a kite which is never going to get off the ground.
Well, actually, Steve, you'd be interested to know that at the end of 2022, the Bank of England did actually commission a study on the feasibility of, or basically the UX for customers to do exactly that. So CBDCs they're not trialed, but they were just looking at how would it work if we did. I guess that they might do that.
Like I know the people who did that work, and they got shut down because they were worried about damaging the viability of the private banking sector. If people had a risk-free form of accounts at the central bank, which would have been risk-free, then they thought that you might see people moving their deposits from the private banks to the CDBCs, and so the whole issue whether the monetary system was convertible was the sticking point. So they didn't go ahead with that idea.
that's here, though. I wonder if a country does adopt it, whether it creates a competitive advantage or not. I'm not sure. So, but that's a whole other subject.
Well, it's like bringing in a large version of the old savings banks that used to be run by postal services, and Japan still has the same system. So, yeah. Well, I think one thing we did, whatever we agree or disagree on, George, we both agree the financial system works badly at the moment.
Yes, I think anybody who doesn't agree with that is if either of us is crazy, they're even crazier.
Indeed. I like that. I like the framing.
Yeah.
There's a very decent way to end things. I think, George Selgin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Please stay on afterwards and let's have a bit more of a chat. But thank you
George,
so much.
nice job.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike and Dave and Steve.
And stepping into the bear pit of people you don't necessarily agree with. So well done. Good on you. And for those of you listening, make sure you share this link, and we will see you all again next week. So take care for now, and we'll see you soon.